It's really nice to hear the topic of ethics being discussed, because so many people have talked about how it's about the development of consciousness, and I think of ethics as a slow development of consciousness. And there's like clearly a lot of pioneering happening and like eagerness to pioneer here, which is a beautiful thing to behold. And I also think about like the history of Western pioneering and the effects that it's had on the planet and on other people, and some of the language, familiar language around like what is human and what is non-human intelligence on this planet. And you know, even there's just like I have some questions and some wariness. Even talking about you know there's this discussion around like a new ontology being revealed or emerging, but it seems very much rooted in old ontologies. So even talking about moving beyond a materialist framework and referencing idealist frameworks which have existed before, I think at best it's sort of like post-materialist. It's still going to be rooted in what is. And I bring this up just because John Mack and the Ariel School have come up so much, but I haven't heard the word Zimbabwe once. And like talking about USOs and thinking about talking about things or the phenomenon studied from 1940 onward, and I think about even Western anthropologists, Griol, going to Mali and encountering the Dogon and writing The Pale Fox, which is about their description of extraterrestrials explicitly, so not just some sort of spiritual beings, but extraterrestrials, and talking about the codex that they received with information on the Sirius star system. So I just wonder what's being done, and I don't think like pioneering is really well-intentioned, the pioneering that's happened geographically, medically. I think it was with the intention of bettering life for those it considered, but I just think that there are gaps sometimes that like lead to ethical, what we now realize are instances of real violence. So I wonder what's being done to, rather than continue to rehabilitate the same framework, the same ontological framework, like truly incorporate other perspectives.
I think this is all about incorporating other perspectives. I only had 20 minutes, but a lot of the ethical values that experiencers are referring back to have a lot in common with a lot of indigenous traditions. And I've articulated this in other places, not just indigenous American, but indigenous people around the world. And as we know, Artie Six Killer Clark has documented a long history of contact with star beings, star people, for indigenous Americans in particular. And so I think the UFO conversation, the experiencer conversation has to be multicultural. I think we have to look at indigenous perspectives and indigenous voices. I don't like to stand up and speak for indigenous voices because I'm not an indigenous person. But I think that should absolutely be a voice and a seat at the table and a really important part of the conversation. And a lot of these new ethical principles are actually ethical principles that some people have always been practicing. They've always had, just looking at indigenous American communities, they've always had an expanded conception of the moral community, of who counts. The earth and land and animals has always been included in their moral calculations. So that matters, and I do think it should be a really important part of the conversation. I was speaking about indigenous people in the Americas, like the Hopi have connection with the Star people. Again, I don't like to speak entirely from that perspective. I've looked for the work of like Vine Deloria and the work of Artie Six Killer Clark.
Over here, what a delicious panel this morning, and what a delicious time to be alive. So. Well, thank you. I have the privilege to work with Division of Perceptual Studies and those folks that are coming. It's the same ontology being revealed through different epistemological means of poking at it. So we have some folks here in the audience that introduce sort of the UAP topic to those folks in academia looking at this world in a deeper fashion and with the same things being revealed. And it's just a delight to watch the dance between those groups and this one and the destined increasing dancing. So I don't have a question, but I have a kudos, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey guys, I really appreciate this. I deeply appreciate this discussion on ethics and experiencers. As we wade into the promising and important study of experiencers, how do we navigate the reality that historically in this field, some of the only people that have paid attention to certain experiencers have been representatives of a national security structure that have, following recommendations of the Robertson panel and other sources, demeaned, victimized, and pathologized experiencers while absolutely depending on experiencers for much of their understanding of NHI and anomalous phenomena in general.
I'll dive in first.
What's that?
I'll dive in first.
Go ahead.
Yeah, great question, Jay. And I think I want to highlight what Jay said there, because you think about the national security state, you think about these movements to try to understand the UFO phenomenon that you would think would begin nuts and bolts. They would be looking for, radar returns, sightings in the sky, ways of examining the technology. But their examination and understanding of the phenomenon inevitably leads them to experiencers, right? You hear about people from NASA showing up Chris Bledsoe's house and trying to understand how he has a connection to the phenomenon that they can't access. So this is absolutely something central. And again, it suggests that the people who most understand this are the people who've actually looked into the phenomenon. They understand the consciousness connection. And I think it's absolutely problematic. I agree with what Jay says. It's a problem that the conversation is being framed from that perspective, that people say on the one hand, we can't possibly trust the government, and yet people are demanding disclosure from the government. So it's kind of a strange situation there. So we have to, I think, take it into our own hands. Like in this tribe here, the people here who are aware of a deeper reality and aware that this is real, we need to have more citizen activism, and we need to get out and raise awareness about this and not wait for the government to tell us what we already know. And we can then take the implications that really matter about how we need to change our civilization, because that might not be coming from the security state, and make sure that people are aware of that as well. So great points, Jay.
First of all, thank you all. This is fantastic. And I'm right here, so I should probably stand up.
Okay.
Yeah.
I couldn't see who was speaking.
So
He's
I
louder.
perhaps have read a little too much John Keel, but a couple of questions I have. We were talking about this at dinner last night with a bunch of people at the conference. But if a human being had done to some of the experiencers, what NHI had done, we would kill them or put them in jail or really be angry, right? Like, there have been a lot of people, indigenous people in Brazil, that have been tracked and killed. There have been people that have been harmed. Like, what are the ethics to that? And then the other part of it where it feels slightly strange, and this kind of comes from Jacques Vallée, is when these beings show up, like, why are they showing up to the kids in Zimbabwe at the aerial school and not Donald Trump? Like, what are they going to do about the climate? They're children, and when you see them as adults, they seem greatly burdened by this experience, and it doesn't seem to be extremely productive for their lives or for the planet. So why did the aliens do this? Like, where are we, and y'all don't, this is kind of an overall kind of existential crisis I'm having about this, so welcome to this. But those are all questions to me.
There's ways to respond,
Yeah.
right? So, first, I'm just going to look at your first question, and I don't know, in terms of the people being killed, but let's look at the people being kidnapped, right? That's kind of what I was talking about in terms of, if we just look at this three-dimensionally through the lens of Western human ethical things like autonomy, like choice, that does seem, it's just like blanket unethical, right? And where the multidimensionality comes in, or the transcendence comes in, is that you can see a lot of different types of initiatory processes throughout history that actually are non-consensual and actually are traumatic. But the idea is that the individual, through that process and that loss of control, gets opened up to an expanded understanding of reality of them and of themselves. But you have to zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture and look at it in a more complex and nuanced way than just they ethically violated me. They kidnapped me and took me against my will. In terms of your question on the, why are they showing up to the Ariel kids? That's very common, and it's kind of used as a debunker's argument that contact isn't happening, because if contact is happening, why aren't they showing up to the world leaders? And in the communication, and again, I can't speak for any non-human being, I don't know. But they express that they, and Max said this, he says they work more subtly. They are influencing human consciousness on the individual level. And I think it makes perfect sense that they would appear to children instead of people who are in a position of power in a regime that is extremely misaligned. I think it makes perfect sense that they show up to people who are in the margins, all right? For people who are not necessarily in positions of power and control, and they're influencing consciousness in subtle ways, in ways that are, as I say, subversive and transformative. And they're not, and I think very intentionally, whatever this experience is, it's not choosing to present itself on the White House lawn. And I think that we need to, consider seriously the reasons why that might be, why it seems to present in the margins instead.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in too. I want to highlight what Kim said there, that this is why we have to be open to redefining what the self is, because I understand your question. But again, the reports from experiencers themselves is that they come into the sense of a multidimensional self. There's even people who have been on board the craft and recognize they almost have a dual personality, and one part of them feels connected to these beings in some way while also coming back to Earth and taking on a different modality. So in that expanded sense of self, not just in terms of laterally, but in terms of past lives, the sense that they knew these beings before they knew their own parents, and like Kim alluded to some degree did agree to this. We're part of the architects of this entire situation. So we have to consider that greater context to be able to answer these questions, and it takes lots of nuance, like I was saying. And I also want to say that I agree with Kim that it makes sense to me, actually, that they don't go to Donald Trump. I'm not sure they would get much of a hearing anyway. But it's because they would believe more in a grassroots effort. And again, I want to suggest that these divisions between selves is porous, right? So if they appear to any of us, especially people on the margins, right? And this gets inputted into collective consciousness, we can all access this, right? Again, the illusion is separation. So I think that there are many, many people across the world having telepathic contact now. So that's the way they tend to work. That's in the lore as well. So it ends up being a grassroots movement, and that actually helps also counter some of the ontological shock. They come from within, sometimes even in dream states where you have less of your usual fight or flight kind of online that you'd have in your waking state. So I think it is happening, and once you consider that broader context, it begins to make some sense.
Sorry.
You go. Go.
Okay, I'll be quick. Thank you very much for your panel. I have a question about the second presentation, but it was sort of broad, so anyone could speak to it. I was very happy to see you bring in the ethics dimension, because I'm in religious studies, and there's just kind of a feeling sometimes that it's, maybe from my colleagues in a conference not such as this, like, why would someone be interested in this topic? Mm-hmm. And that made it more concrete for me as a way to think about, like, what is happening here with these people and these experiences that I would be interested in, this expansion of ethics. And then the other issue I wanted to just touch on that you brought up is about the initiatory process as a way to lead to this expanded ethics. And in my mind, this is a kind of learning process. So I was wondering if you had thought about the learning dimension of this, like a kind of learned ethics, and that the initiatory process is indeed like traumatic and ritualized or something. Like the Dogon people were brought up a second ago, and for example, this is like an initiatory tradition. It's been going on forever, but it's a way to learn, different way to learn. So I was just curious about if you had thought about learning as initiation, or this is kind of learning process that's going on in order to reach this higher understanding of ethics.
Absolutely, and I think some speakers this next panel are going to talk a little bit more about that. But there's also, I think, a process of multidimensional knowing and like new epistemic practices and a widening scope of what counts as knowledge and our processes for acquiring knowledge, and being open to intersubjective practices of knowledge and forms of knowledge that may involve things like non-ordinary states of consciousness, contact with the subtle realms, things that a lot of cultures have used to kind of open you up to more expanded ways of knowing. That's absolutely all of it, right? There's a layer of reality, metaphysics, and there's the knowing, the epistemology, and then the ethics, and they're all kind of interwoven in there. And I think that these experiences are subversive of all of them, and they introduce new knowledge processes, new understandings of reality. And I just wanted to bring in the ethical question because I really think it hasn't been brought in or discussed enough, or discussed in any way that's nuanced, right? And I think that ethical reasoning is really interwoven with those new epistemic processes and those new metaphysical understandings.
Okay, I'm going to go now. I have a question for Mike. Wondering if you could speak to feelings you may have about the unique role that artists have in moving this conversation forward.
Ooh, excellent question. This is a complex subject, like difficult to wrap your mind around, and I think that for me, the creative process and the role of the artist is the same as the role of the poet, in essence, that there comes a point when you get dead-ended if you over-intellectualize this stuff, and you have to depend on some other modality to absorb it, through poetry, through art, through the, I would say, the lessons of the story. I think I mentioned the word story like 30 times in my talk, and I really depend on that because someone can tell a story, they will tell a surface story, and it doesn't take much to tap into the what's going on below the waterline, let's say the lesson of that story, or the deeper meaning of that story. So the role of the artist is to tap into that subtle realm where these truths can emerge indirectly.